Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the August session of our Great Books series. This month, we're going to be completing our 2-month reflection on the Age of Resilience by Jeremy Rifkin. That's presented by one of our Ubiquity community, Randy Cleveland. It's very timely, as it turns out. As is often the case with our books, if you think about the one quality that humanity needs at this moment, under the current conditions of extreme and increasingly extreme duress, it is resilience. And Jeremy Rifkin wrote a book some time ago on resilience that continues to be a profound illumination to the present day. So without further ado, I want to just welcome Randy for his second lecture. He'll provide a presentation, a PowerPoint for about 50 minutes, and then I'll circle back and we will dialogue for the balance of the time. All you students, be sure to have your questions ready so we can engage in good academic and intellectual dialogue. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to our Great Books for August 2024. Randy, if you want to turn on your video, take yourself off mute. I turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Jim, for moderating. Thanks, George, for providing technical backup on the Zooming. Again, I'm speaking from the traditional unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. Today has been noisy with Canadian geese and ravens. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so are there any issues there on sharing the screen?
No, we're good. We see it.
George, can you move the picture off the slide or not? On mine, it's on the slide.
We see Great Books August 13th.
Oh yeah, you can see the whole thing. Good enough.
Yes, yeah. So you see the zoom control, but we don't see that. You can move it. You can drag it somewhere to the bottom.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay. Thank you. Today's agenda includes a summary of part 4, outlining what a resilient society might look like. 2, a shallow dive into Rifkin's references for 2 of the key themes. And 3, why this book was even suggested. But before we begin, a quick recap of last month's presentation. Rifkin, a social philosopher, economist, and long-term political activist, argued that we are at the cusp of a necessary paradigm shift from the age of progress to the age of resilience, leaping through the third industrial revolution on the way. We reviewed contrasting features between the 2 ages, some of which are shown in this chart. The last row, for instance, speaks to how the world unfolds. In the age of progress, a linear cause and effect is assumed, where the outcomes are mechanistic, controllable, certain, and predictable, and where imagination and consciousness are mere epiphenomena. The ultimate control is preemption, that is, the elimination and foreclosure of the future. In the age of resilience, the process of life is iterative. It responds to feedbacks. Outcomes precipitate out of potentiality and uncertainty through the intention and participation of human and non-human agents. In part 4, the book's final section of chapters 10 through 13, Rifkin discusses 4 characteristics of the age of resilience. First, the third industrial revolution, a regenerative infrastructure, where he argues for the systemic interdependency of infrastructure and consciousness. Second, the expansion of our natural empathy through bioregional governance, where he argues for the lateral democratization of power and agency. Third, bureaucracies of interlapping collaborations, where he argues for distributed knowledge, authority, responsibility, and accountability. And fourth, the emergence of a biospheric consciousness of stewardship, where he presents the dialectical relationship between empathy and transcendence, and the paradox between empathy and entropy. Let's dig deeper. In chapter 10, Rifkin proposes that The way we conceptualize the world and manage our economic, political, and social activities changes as a result of epochal infrastructure revolutions in communication, energy and power, modes of transportation and logistics, and water. This somewhat reverses the assumption that a change in thinking precedes social phenomena, with the notion that serendipitous discoveries synchronously change the way we do things and the consciousness that makes sense of them. So his thesis is, and I quote, human infrastructure revolutions provide a technological prosthesis that enables large numbers of people to come together in more complex economic, social, and political arrangements, performing more differentiated roles in self-organizing systems that act as a whole. Economics, social institutions, physical infrastructure, science, and cosmology all arise together. Exchanges of communication, energy, water, and stuff, mediated by infrastructures of our own making, change our sense of boundedness or space and our experience of the pace and urgency of life or time, and our sense of the self and how we draw boundaries between ourself and others. In the Third Industrial Revolution, or TIR, Rifkin devoted a whole book to how different infrastructures were accompanied by very different social organizations. This is a very condensed chart of the key elements. The central idea is that the suite of four infrastructures arise together, and their coordination leads to different governance structures and management methodologies. Any element of a particular industrial revolution shown in one column is ultimately incompatible with the adjacent element in any other revolution and eventually becomes irrelevant. Look at the last column for a summary of the current transition. For Rifkin, quote, TIR infrastructure is a cohort of smart, nonlinear, self-organizing ecosystems that communicate, self-power, and manage their integrated motility, constantly learning from their many feedback loops and ever evolving and transforming themselves as they interact with one another. End quote. Decision-making, authority, and accountability are horizontally distributed through cooperative networks rather than vertically integrated through the still dominant command and control hierarchies. This creates the opportunity to transition from global disempowering monopolies to glocal, that is, locally owned and globally connected, place-based small and medium enterprises. The key goal moves from productive efficiency to biosphere stewardship, and the metric of achievement moves from GDP to place-based quality of life indicators. Rifkin proposes that Tim Berners-Lee is the iconic figure associated with lateral communications connectivity in the Third Industrial Revolution. Not only is he the inventor of the World Wide Web, but he also developed and standardized exchange protocols that democratized access to potentially empower local control over transformative change. Wikipedia states that Tim BL made net neutrality a human network right. Changing the infrastructure system, then, is one way to jumpstart a change in consciousness. Rifkin argues that you cannot build the next generation economy on the back of the Second Industrial Revolution. A completely new platform is needed to launch into resilience. In this chapter, he introduces the economic and social benefits of TIR by itemizing the features of his $16 trillion plan, America 3.0, a plan written for U.S. Democratic Senate leader Chuck Schumer in 2021. He is determined to defeat any argument that the transition is unaffordable. This plan advances funding from public coffers, but with the assurance of short-term payback and then long-term financial regenerativity. By the way, this total retooling of the American economy requires an annual investment of less than 4 times Israel's current spending on the Gaza war. It is a plan that demands imaginative thinking, not extrapolations of past thinking, to achieve transformative resilience and a wholesale change in the entire socio-ecological system. It is in this chapter that he adds to his prior book by postulating that the TIR is a transitional phase from the industrial age of progress to a distinct age of resilience. Rifkin is aware of the potential for coercion of the resilient revolution by big nation states and international corporations, which he calls the dark side, and has on several occasions engaged in court battles to prevent this, especially in genetic engineering. Ultimately, he is convinced that the profitability of current capitalism will collapse because of the significantly reduced marginal costs of the new TIR Internet of Everything, and because the young generations will simply not allow the planet and its distinct societies to collapse into ecological ruin and economic disparity. He recognizes that the deficient side of the current age of progress is totalitarianism, that is, a retrenchment in a fossilized stability of a once successful but unrepeatable dissipative structure. Whereas previous industrial revolutions were based on enclosed, privatized resources requiring military security, the third is so distributed and networked that it cannot be effectively owned top-down without draconian measures that bankrupt global actors and unacceptably castrate all semblance of freedom. This reminds me of the Greek comedy Lysistrata by Aristophanes, where the women ended the Peloponnesian War through withholding sex. This, I guess, was a bottom-up networking resisting an untenable abuse of power. Chapter 11 deals with the critical issue of governance. With a few rare exceptions, such as the 1987 Montreal Protocol on the depletion of the ozone layer, Second Industrial Revolution nation-state organizations have a very poor track record in addressing war, poverty, pandemics, migration, the environment, and climate change. All of these are dynamics across semi-permeable membranes where the political reaction often hardens the borders rather than address the flows. The model is spatially incompatible with the life-regenerative aspirations of a resilient, networked society, especially one focused on the convulsions of a rewilding planet. Although political repatriation with a dynamic vertical connection to the biosphere is underway, currents of nationalism and its shadow terrorism are powerful threats undermining this transition. The rural-urban and developing country divides are hardening. The growing clamor for secession reflects a frustration that pulls equally from both the desire for fortress isolation and the yearning for bioregions and their global interdependence. TIR is biased towards smaller and more agile and responsive economic enterprises, as well as smaller cities and towns embedded in bioregions. In some ways, COVID-19 nudged us towards both. Caring for the planet is a local affair. A viable response to climate change entails not only the reduction of carbon and its relocation from the atmosphere to the soil, oceans, and living ecologies, but also the restoration and maintenance of not less than 50% of the Earth's land area as intact natural ecosystems with an eyes-on, hands-on engagement with the planet. Since 2/3 of all living species of the majority of sequestered carbon is in the forests, these, centered on watersheds, are prime candidates for stewardship. Bioregions can be broken down at the continental and then smaller scales. Environmental carrying capacity, modified by a per capita global footprint, would be one indicator of the health of the bioregion. Rifkin outlines the history, successes, and failures of two major bioregional governance institutions traversing the US and Canada. Cascadia, established in 1970, containing 7 of the 10 largest carbon-absorbing forests in the world, and the North American Laurentian Great Lakes, established in 1983, containing 20% of the world's fresh water. However, the transition to bioregional governance highlights the conflict between nation states and bioregions, and between industrial paradigms of economic efficiency for utilitarian productivity and regenerative resilience for thriving ecosystems. Nation states attempt to guarantee the flow of resources for industrial exploitation, whereas bioregions focus on ecosystem health and coevolution. How this conflict might be favorably resolved is the subject of Chapter 12, entitled Representative Democracy Makes Way for Distributed Bureaucracy. Rifkin starts the chapter with the evolving notion of freedom. From the loyalty and homage of medieval serf within a covenant of safety and security, that is, freedom from harm, then to the Enlightenment notion of the freedom of an autonomous individual contracting personal labor in exchange for goods and services. This was a negative freedom, to be self-sufficient, an exclusive island to oneself. And finally, to the emerging notion of freedom based on interconnectivity and inclusive system-wide access, with the right to choose which of many agencies one participates. In this case, each of us wears a multicolored cloak of allegiances, laterally and flexibly connected in our collaborations. This distributed bureaucracy is distinct from a representative democracy, where the latter largely fails to earn trust. They fail to enlist skin in the game participation, and they fail to adequately represent the growing diversity of perspectives and strategies, especially in times of mass migration, immigration, and the growing confrontation with the other. Currently, movements of all kinds for labor, voting, human equity and nature rights, climate change, and anti-racism carry the passion of inclusion, but they are rarely deliberative within or collaborative with other movements without, nor do they garner real partnership with the conventional governing institutions, which are often hostile towards their very existence. Recently, some European jurisdictions, for instance, have ruled that environmental groups are terrorist organizations. Rifkin provides a short overview of the growing size, pay scale, and economic contribution of the pejoratively named non-government or non-profit organizations, meaning they are outside the norm despite their growing influence in schooling, policing, municipal budgeting, and education. He is careful to distinguish between the decentralization of centralized bureaucratic objectives and the distribution of governance, where the definition of the problem, the openness to external knowledge and experience, decision-making implementation, and accountability remain with the citizens' assemblies. When bureaucracies are bioregionally accountable, they must be responsive to geographically contiguous and functionally overlapping groups. With consensus decision-making, the polarization of ideologies is overcome in favor of pragmatic action and continuous learning. This increases resilience through the enactment of diverse, place-based strategies in real time, responding to the evolving dynamics of complex adaptive systems. Rifkin says we can only mature in bureaucracy through a deep empathic connection to everything. And that is chapter 13. Chapter 13 is distilled from his 2009 tome, The Empathic Civilization, The Race to Global Consciousness in a World in Crisis. Since I'll spend more time on this later, I'll keep this summary short. Rifkin contends that we are neurologically wired for relationship and feeling, as if we are the other. From developmental psychology, he shows that early childhood maturation is a balance of attachment security and adventurous exploration, which together promote relationships with family and, over time, an ever more expansive domain of the others. A poor balance results in alienation, or alternatively, the sociopath and authoritarian. Further, the growing awareness of the fragility and mortality of the individual is key to an identification with the vulnerability, suffering, and struggle of others, including other species. Identification with vulnerability and death are central to compassion and acts of care. He contends that our empathy evolves with civilizations and their dominant infrastructures. I quote, "Empathy also evolves over history and is deeply intertwined with the evolution of society and the rise and fall of civilizations, a social terrain little explored by social scientists. It's when a new infrastructure is being erected and deployed across society that empathy evolves and expands. Each civilization's infrastructure brings with it a unique economic paradigm, a new social order, a new form of governance, and an ecological footprint, along with an accompanying narrative worldview to which its population can give its allegiance. In each instance, the new infrastructure enables a more expansive empathic bond that can encompass and emotionally unite the diverse populations living, working, and attending to the new infrastructure. Rifkin traces the unfolding maturation of the all-encompassing empathic sentiment to the Romantics, especially to the late 17th century polymath Goethe and his phenomenological approach to a living universe in constant flux. He says, Goethe's nature was not fixed and unchanging, but rather pulsing with a novelty and replete with surprises and synergies. In short, brimming with aliveness. To make it clear how different this is, Rifkin writes, I quote, Goethe called his scientific approach a delicate empiricism, which is in a most inward way, makes itself identical with the object and therefore becomes the actual theory. His scientific method is the near mirror opposite of Bacon's. He believed that his power of thought is active while united with the objects, and that his thinking does not separate itself from the objects, arguing that true insights come not from detached observation, but from deep participation with the phenomena under investigation. Rifkin cites E.O. Wilson as the proponent of a contemporary empathic capacity in biophilia. Wilson thought humans had an innate tendency to focus on life and life-like processes, which Rifkin suggests is, quote, the single most powerful force by which to animate the age of resilience. Here, the extension of the psychological balance of attachment and exploration results in the conscious attachment to and stewardship of place. As I mentioned, Rifkin argues that infrastructure and empathy evolve together. This chart outlines how our allegiances have changed from the blood of clan and tribe to religious associations to ideologies of nation states. Social authority has changed along with how we demarcate the self, we-ness, and the other. We have transitioned from an unconscious animism through the dictates of faith and the discursive conclusions of reason to the potential relationality of a delicate empiricism. At each step, we have become progressively alienated from precursor social organizations, which we tend to disparage as immature or underdeveloped, while at the same time, we remember each of them deep in our psyche. He is optimistic that the emerging TIR will support a truly empathic relationality that encompasses all life on the planet and can exercise all preceding levels of empathy. At the end of the book, Rifkin associates empathy and biophilia with two critical challenges for the age of resilience. The first is decoupling the expansive development of empathy from the excessive growth of our entropic footprint. And I quote, the irony is that our growing empathic awareness has been made possible by an ever greater consumption of the Earth's energy and other resources, resulting in a dramatic deterioration of the health of the planet. We now face the haunting prospect of approaching global empathy in a highly energy-intensive, interconnected world, riding on the back of an escalating entropy bill that now threatens catastrophic climate change in our very existence. Resolving the empathy-entropy paradox will likely be the critical test of our species' ability to survive and flourish on Earth in the future. This will necessitate a fundamental rethinking of our philosophical, economic, and social models, not to mention our civilizational infrastructures. The second challenge is the broader understanding of transcendence as an integral aspect of empathy and the evolution of consciousness in civilization. I quote, we know the importance of empathy because were it absent in our neurocircuitry, we would not be able to feel the fragility of another person's life and their drive to flourish. It's at these moments that we come to understand the awe of existence. And without awe, we would have no way to wonder. And without wonder, we would be absent imagination. And without imagination, we would not be able to experience transcendence. And without the ability to transcend ourselves, we would not be able to empathize with another. Empathy is cognitive as well as emotional and is intimate with our worldview. For Rifkin, empathy increases our awareness of self and other in a virtuous circle and underlies the dynamic of the evolution of ourselves and our civilization. Writing in 2009 about the relationship between empathy, transcendence, and consciousness, he said, I quote, "The deepening sense of selfhood, the extension of empathy to broader and more inclusive domains of reality, and the expansion of human consciousness is the transcendent process by which we explore the mystery of existence and discover new realms of meaning." Rifkin contends, therefore, that we are fundamentally in search of universal intimacy, an apparent paradox. He says, quote, "Owen Barfield believed that our species is on the cusp of the third great stage of human consciousness, a reassertion of our kinship with the natural world. But this time around, the biophilic empathic leap is a self-aware choice to reparticipate wholly and unreservedly with the rest of life on the planet, to experience universal intimacy. This comes not out of blind superstition, but rather out of a deep empathic, mindful, and cognitive understanding of our abiding attachment to life." He also insists that this universal intimacy necessarily includes the will to act. That concludes the chapter summary. I promised last month to dig just a little bit deeper into some key themes of the book. I'll start with this one, resilience. You will recall this slide where Rifkin referred to ecologist C.S. Halling for the emerging science of resilience, underpinning the study of complex adaptive socioeconomic systems. The citations refer to further articles that explore resilience, adaptability, and transformability in greater detail, and shed light on the questions raised in our last session about Rifkin's intended meaning of that troublesome word, resilience. These are the key references I'll be drawing from. They'll be on the slide when you come back for your reference. To start with, a system is a set of activities. That is not substances or things in the Descartesian sense, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. Both natural and social systems are increasingly interconnected, especially about 75 years ago when the Anthropocene superseded the 12,000-year Holocene. To define resilience, Halling says, resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. In other words, to stay in the same basin of attraction. Or, as Carl Folk simplifies, the capacity to change in order to maintain the same identity. Identity enables agency in the system, but given change in the system and its context, the preservation of identity can also be a problem. That is, identity, including core values and worldviews, can be a constraint to adaptability, a resistance to change. Resilience is part of a triad of interconnected, interrelated change responses, including resilience, adaptability, and transformability. These need to be understood within the temporality of systems, well known as the adaptive life cycle, and more technically, the state space of specific variables or archetypes. In the context of Rifkin's book, these variables could be autonomy or freedom, efficiency or linear input-output causality, and productivity or robustness, by which the system's health is managed and measured. Systems generally have a lemniscate trajectory of states. Folk says, the common trajectory is from a phase of rapid growth where resources are freely available and there is high resilience, that's at the bottom left, through the upper right, capital accumulation, into a gradually rigidifying phase where most resources are locked up and there is little flexibility or novelty. Then, by a sudden collapse, that's the bottom right, into a release phase of chaotic dynamics in which relationships and structures are undone, and then into a final phase in the upper left of reorganization, where novelty can prevail. The growth conservation dynamics reflect a more or less predictable, relatively slow for loop, and the release reorganization dynamics represent a chaotic, fast back loop that strongly influences the nature of the next for loop. but external or higher scale influences can cause a move from any phase to any other. Let's use this as a sociological lens. As a civilization, we are now focused on the perpetuation of the productive phases, the front loop, and consciously resisting the movement toward the latter phases, the reorganization of the back loop. The resistance, hanging on to the productivity of the fossil fuel past, causes systemic turbulence, rigidity, extremely low resilience, and a rougher ride through subsequent phases. Resilience is greatest during the reorganization and early exploitation phases. Resilience is a balance of structure and flexibility. Flexibility is the diversity of strategic response alternatives, whereas structure increases the robustness of growth and productivity, as well as the persistence of the system. The balance is dynamic relative to the specific phase of the adaptive cycle. So, system dynamics are simply not simple, and there is more. Systems are embedded in a context. System and context are co-creative. We touched on this last month in the discussion about fields. First, systems are within a basin of attraction and within a larger stability landscape or a set of basins that are each compatible with the persistence of the system. Note that a system, and that's the yellow, does not have to move to find itself in a different basin of attraction. The landscape can morph because of the accelerating or increasing impact of the system itself, landing the system in a new basin of attraction. Climate change is like this. The environment changed, but the neoliberal age of progress did not. The properties of a basin of attraction include the attractor's breadth or developmental space, resistance or its depth, precariousness or its vulnerability to cross a threshold into another attractor, and nestedness within other systems or a panarchy. There may be more than one possible state of system space or viable attractors within a stability landscape. Attractors, though accessible, may not be equally desirable. There could be good reasons to change any of these parameters of breadth, depth, precariousness, or nestedness to affect resilience, adaptation, or transformation. The decision on what to do depends on maintaining the qualitative well-being of the system and context. If that assessment is not made consciously, it will be made involuntarily anyway. That's what Rifkin refers to as a rewilding Earth. Finally, the system is nested within others at larger and smaller scales, where the speed of the adaptive cycle is faster or slower. Change can be influenced either bottom up or top down. Resilience at one level can be maintained by adaptability at another. This diagram shows both directions of influence. I quote Gunderson: "The revolt connection can cause a critical change in one cycle to cascade up to a vulnerable stage in a larger and slower one. The remember connection facilitates renewal by drawing down on the potential for capital that has been accumulated and stored in a larger, slower cycle." End quote. But note that successful transformation at one level requires some stability at another. Instability at all levels generally leads to collapse rather than transformation. So in answer to the question raised last week, it's not about resilience or adaptability or transformability, but a discriminating balance within a full awareness of the changing dynamics within the system as a whole and the surrounding context. If we are seeking persistence at the planetary level, then regenerative transformation at lower bioregional levels is appropriate. Changing the dynamics at a higher level usually requires that the higher level is moving into the back loop of its life cycle, and that the lower level has already reorganized and is moving into the mature stage of the foreloop. Timing is everything. Rifkin's idea of glocalization for planetary health is consistent with this model. Until now, the higher level of Earth integrity has not been threatened by revolts from below, but now we are into new territory. This densely populated chart summarizes the organizing principles of complex adaptive systems, along with a few of the associated concepts and attributes. Let's take just the last row Emergence through complex causality is an example. Emergence is a new behavior at a higher level of complexity, not inherent or predictable from its predecessors. It is an outcome of transformability. Transformability means 1, defining and creating new stability landscapes, or 2, changing the driving variables, such as Bacon's subjectivity and control into Goethe's delicate empathic empiricism, or 3, changing the scale of the panarchy that defines the system, either to a higher or to a subordinate level. Rifkin's move to biosphere consciousness is transformative at a scale that transcends and includes the nation state by creating a bottom-up revolt from the embedded level of the bioregion. The system attributes required for transformability overlap with adaptability, and, to quote Walker, emphasize novelty, diversity, and organization in human capital, trust, strengths, and variety in institutions, speeds and kinds of cross-scale communication, both within the panarchy and between other systems elsewhere, end quote. If there is a challenge, it is this. The current attractor of the multinational corporate level has become very deep, which means that its resistance to change, that is the energy required to escape the attractor, has become almost unassailable. Anticipatory, but especially preemptive algorithmic controls only deepen the attractor, which is why Rifkin spends so much time talking about them. Donella Meadows, one of the great systems thinkers, mapped the levels of system intervention with increasingly greater capacity to move from resilience to adaptability and ultimately to transformability, which she defined as the power to shift paradigms to deal with new challenges. Note that she places communication infrastructures in the middle of the pack, but Rifkin's suggestions tend to intervene at multiple levels of the system simultaneously, that is, systemically. Rifkin himself moves to the new paradigm of regenerativity based on a living system understanding of the Earth system. You recall Rifkin's challenge to decouple entropy and empathy? This is the entropy reduction side of the solution, where humans create negentropy. That is, they give back more than they take. They participate as nature. I repeat, they participate not with, but as nature in the coevolution of the whole system by changing the key driver of the system to an empathic civilization. In answer to Georgie's question last month regarding sustainability, I was referring to this diagram that places sustainability at the neutral point between business as usual and Rifkin's regenerativity. Given time, I think I'll skip this one. Next, we dive deeper into empathy. Earlier today, we made several points. 1, we are wired to be empathetic. 2, the scope of our empathic embrace has expanded with the evolution of civilizations, enabled by its evolving communication infrastructure, and experienced as an emergent quality of consciousness. And 3, biophilia, an extension of empathy to entangle the planet as a whole in radical relationality, is the emergent phase of empathy. In 2009, after 9 years of research, Rifkin wrote the 600-page study called The Empathic Civilization, which he considers one of his most important, even if not the most influential. For Rifkin, empathy requires cognitive, emotional, and volitional capacities of a mature human being. That maturity has developed over historic time with the deepening awareness of the self as a bounded individual. That maturity is also a product of cultural attunement, that is, the awareness of expanding social relations. He says, and I quote, empathic development and the development of selfhood go hand in hand and accompany the increasingly complex energy-consuming social structures that make up the human journey. He reminds us that the very term empathy didn't become part of the human vocabulary until 1909, about the same time that modern psychology began to explore the internal dynamics of the unconscious and consciousness itself. When E.B. Titchener translated Robert Vishner's word Einfühlung, meaning how observers project their own sensibilities onto an object of adoration or contemplation, and is a way of explaining how one comes to appreciate and enjoy beauty. The word then migrated from aesthetics via the work of Willem Dilthey to mean the mindful apprehension of another's being. The growing awareness and fear of death became linked to the vulnerability of death, which rounded out the essential components of empathy, that is, self, other, and shared mortality. Rifkin reinforces this position by writing, "While we are all born with a predisposition to experience empathic distress, this core aspect of our being only develops into true empathic consciousness by the continuous struggle of differentiation as a self-aware individual and integration in civilization as a feature of society and our relationships. Far from squelching the empathic impulse, it is the dynamics of unfolding civilization that is the fertile ground for its development and for human transcendence. An undifferentiated human collectivity in a state of nature that is animistic may be predisposed to empathy, but is also unprepared to express it in the universalizing way the Romantics had intended. The Romantics were too close to their times to step back and reflect on how the very society they were justifiably critiquing also created the very conditions that allowed the empathic impulse to express itself so forcefully. Again, deepening self-awareness within social relations is the necessary polarity to a more inclusive empathic capacity. This is a summary of Rifkin's cultural evolution model as it relates the technologies of communication to our sense of self in the bounds of our empathic embrace. In the last row, the emergent biospheric consciousness works hand in hand with open source networked communications. We take on multiple roles as nodes within a variety of distinct networks, which one allows greater empathic expression of different dramaturgical aspects of a deepening self and empathic engagement with a range of others, and two, expand our scope of care. The sense of self matures from the recognition of a personality that we engage therapeutically as an object to the authenticity of an individuated self as subject. The shadow sides of these are many, beginning with fraudulent deceit and varieties of trolling. The age of progress can be distinguished from the emergent age of resilience with this summary of the guiding notions of freedom, equality, and moral character. Remember that the preceding ages are subsumed within the emergent, not lost. That's quite different from an equally plausible reversion into the shadow side of a deficient era. These charts make it look like cultural evolution is monolithic and linear. Rifkin goes to a great deal of trouble to document the evolution of empathy to show that there are undercurrents of alternative empathic expressions within a culture. He spends some time with the Enlightenment illustrating this nuanced dynamic. The Enlightenment, highlighted by Bacon's scientific method, Descartes' mathematical objectivity, and Newton's mechanical lawfulness, included the intellectual landscape of Immanuel Kant's a priori disembodied moral law. On the one hand, this moral law illustrated the bifurcation of mind and nature emerging at the time, but was also a secularization of the bygone age of faith. In contrast, Vico, who slightly preceded Kant, can be associated with the self-determination of the Enlightenment's autonomous individual, had also written that the individual had to be understood relationally, when in 1728 he said, "Every life is lived within the context of others we interact with, either in real time or in our memories of past times." In direct opposition to Kant, Schopenhauer insisted in 1839 on the primacy of embodied experience as the basis of moral action. For the age of progress, Kant's moral law prevailed, but the others were undercurrents in the back loop of embedded adaptive cycles whose time had not yet come. The Romantics like Rousseau, Schelling, Blake, and Goethe looked at nature not as a soul fallen in sin to be exploited in utilitarian terms, but as the source of creativity that was continually transcending itself through imaginative identification with humanity and the world soul through a deep, numinous empathy. Shelley wrote, quote, "A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of the moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause." The Romantics, although unveiling the empathic impulse, tended to disparage civilization in its entirety, especially discursive thought. Rifkin, however, finds value in the increasing differentiation of the cognitive, emotive, and volitional aspects of human experience achieved in the modern progressive era. In seeking a contemporary synthesis, he draws on many, including Mary Gordon, who says, quote, "Empathic maturity is particularly correlated with critical thinking. The ability to entertain conflicting feelings and thoughts, be comfortable with ambiguity, approach problems from a number of perspectives, and listen to another's point of view are essential emotional building blocks to engage in critical thinking. Gordon makes the telling observation that love grows brains." Rifkin concludes poetically that the dialectic between differentiation of the individual and integration in a biospheric whole is the quest for universal intimacy. He says, "The search for intimacy and universality at the same time continually forces the human mind to stretch itself in both directions. Although the two realms often appear at odds, the reality is that human beings are forever searching for universal intimacy, a sense of total belonging. It is our empathic nature that allows us to experience the seeming paradox of greater intimacy in more expansive domains. The quest for universal intimacy is the very essence of what we mean by transcendence." He is fully aware of the difficulty of this transition and the attraction of the shadows, oppression, violence, terrorism, and isolation. If you watched Rifkin's short RSA video on empathy, you'll know that he is intrigued by empathy's underlying neurophysiology. If you have a neurological background, you know that empathy is a right hemisphere function. McGilchrist clarifies the experiential difference. Quote, "The brain's left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, disembodied, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, always imperfectly known, and to this world it exists in a relationship of care." He goes on to say, quote, "Because of the right hemisphere's openness to the interconnectedness of things, it is interested in others as individuals and in how we relate to them. It is the mediator of empathic identification. What is critically important is that the relationship is asymmetric. It is a panarchy where the left hemisphere must be subsumed within the right. McGilchrist is clear that there is what might be called ontological asymmetry. That is the primacy of the right hemisphere's interactions with whatever exists. The right hemisphere is the primary mediator of experience from which the conceptualized, represented world of the left hemisphere derives, and on which it depends. That makes empathy the master of abstract rationality. Accordingly, the left brain needs to relinquish the age of progress and reason and open to a deeper and richer presencing in the age of empathic resilience." Rifkin concludes the empathic civilization with the conviction that our embodiment, the development of self-awareness that facilitated the felt experience of an expanding domain of others, was necessary for our re-participation in the processes of nature through the exercise of individual free will. He concludes the empathic civilization with, in the past, participation was not willed, but rather fated. The self was not developed sufficiently to make self-aware choices. In the case of our Paleolithic forebears, fear of nature's wrath as much as dependency conditioned the relationship. To re-participate with nature willingly by exercising free will is what separates biosphere consciousness from everything that has gone before. 13 years later, he concluded the age of resilience by again evoking this conscious participation as nature, but this time adding the notion of universal intimacy or deep empathy. This slide concluded our discussion of chapter 13, so we have circled back. That concludes the dive. We return to the surface. You may wonder why I suggested Rifkin for great books. Last month, I mentioned similar works by Chomsky, Pauling, Klein, Eisenstein, and yet none of them mention Rifkin or the Third Industrial Revolution. And generally, they don't mention each other. Paul Hawken's Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in Just One Generation, published in 2021, is organized on similar keywords like regeneration, wilding, and bioregionalism, including Cascadia, but again, there is no cross-referencing between any of these authors. There are books written by indigenous authors regarding resurgence and reconciliation with the land, ancestrality, and futurality, and they wouldn't recognize Rifkin either. Isn't that curious? Each of them shouting in the confines of their own echo chambers. But Rifkin is in the arena. He is walking the tightrope with all of the risk that entails. He is trying to change the juggernaut of a system heading toward the abyss from inside the system by speaking and expanding a language it understands. Many are creating a new home for the already disenchanted and disenfranchised. Rifkin is trying to build bridges for the captives of the old world, building them an escape route to a new one. Rifkin is trying to understand how an ecological change in worldview results in viable and specific ways of living, producing, and governing. It's the difference between the survivors at the margins of the apocalypse and someone like Rifkin who doubts there are any margins. Some, like Rifkin, will try to steer a big ship from colliding with rocky shoals. Others will jump ship for the nearest island. But we're in this together. What's ahead of us is partly transition and transformation, and partly catastrophe and revolution. It will not be clear-cut. It will be messy. The impacts will, as always, be uneven. Nudging us to a different future is Rifkin's goal. His books, such as this one, will not likely be remembered even in the near future, but he has chosen an arduous path of critical thought and on-the-ground trial by fire in the crucible of working with wicked problems. Rifkin's name will be on the manifest of those individuals who have embarked on this Save the World journey, as will all of us on this Zoom call. It's the imperfection of his work, the incompleteness of his journey, that will challenge each of us to write a better story, a truly great book, or perform the empathic act that really will change the world. Jim, do we have time for comments and questions? I can stop sharing my screen. I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Randy. Boy, I had no idea how integral empathy was to critical thinking and various other traditionally considered left brain activities. That's quite extraordinary. I didn't know any of that. So thank you for sharing. That's really profound, actually.
You're welcome. He doesn't actually mention McGilchrist's work on the left brain, right brain, but he does mention Mary Gordon, and she very much works on a right brain, left brain analysis.
Yeah. You know, it's so extraordinary how love and affection and empathy broaden the scope of consciousness and cognitive awareness. And it's another indicator of how closely intertwined the heart is with the head.
Yes.
And as the heart expands, the head actually becomes more rigorous.
And Rifkin makes the other connection too, and that is the volition, the embodiment, the body, the will, the
Yeah,
determination to act. And that once you get that connection made, then action is inevitable.
yeah. Well, good. Well, listen, I'm gonna ask you participants to raise your hands and ask your questions. And we're gonna start. I noticed that Michelle Dupree has a question in the Q&A. While this book is exceptionally important in outlining a path to peace and true democracy, I notice it stops short of calling out the need for an intuitive education in order to be able to actually implement America 3.0. There seems to be an academic dancing around with terms like empathy, biophilia, consciousness, and such, when it really points to exploring our six senses. I can't imagine that change at Rifkin scale can be had if we don't embrace intuition as the key to increasing empathy. I'm curious if Rifkin ever explores intuition as the means for fostering greater self-awareness, critical thinking, self-healing, or adjustment, free will, and harmonious relationships. I'm also curious what Schumer has done with Rifkin's manifesto.
That's an incredible question. I haven't run into him in this book or the others I've read talking about intuition as a distinct capacity. But what he does talk about is creativity. And in his discussion of creativity, he gets very close to speaking of etheric imagination. So, and he does talk about imagination in that one quote that I brought up. So no to the intuition, but I think his understanding of creativity and imagination comes fairly close. He certainly is aware of Goethe and the gentle empiricism that Goethe explored and worked with his entire life. And he's very close to Goethe. And Goethe was certainly intuitive in his approach.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Michelle Blair. Michelle, welcome. Allow to talk. And I'm promoting you to a panelist. So you can open up your video and interact with Randy.
All right, let me start video. Here we go.
There we go. Hello.
Randy, first of all, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. There was so much information. It was just like, wow, this will be ruminating in my mind for a while.
And George will put it up so you can look at it again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm teaching the great books next month. And one of the things I keep ruminating about for myself is where instincts come into this, because that is really what Jung talks about, that our instinctual life is connected to our earthly life, like that spirit and matter are not separate. And so you talk about this, but I'm wondering in your work, if there has been this understanding of why our psyche has been so impacted because of our technological life, because we are not connected to nature, because we are nature itself. And if he talks about this aspect of our instincts, because they're not just biological, this is our spirit, or it's our spiritual reflex. So I'm wondering in his work, because if we don't address the psyche, then we don't know how to really remedy our own fracturing our souls, really, which is the earth. The earth has a soul. We have everything is ensouled. So I guess it's a long statement and question at the same time about instincts.
He
Question.
yeah, in the book, Empathic Civilization, a monster book, he talks about the progress of psychological understanding of the human being, and embeddedness being the reciprocal of relationality. So the more relational you become, the more embedded you become, and which holds him to the, he's not a utopian, and he talks about that a lot. He says that the utopians are people who are trying to leave all of the embeddedness of nature behind. They're looking for immortality through technology. They're looking for the afterlife that rewards them for suffering through the earth. So he's very much aware of the polarity between embeddedness in nature as nature and empathy with as part of the empathic thing. In his work in psychology, and I put a slide up just briefly, he talks about moving through the autonomous self, which is really extracted from nature, to an understanding of the psychological self, which in some ways looks at itself as an object. And that's a problem. And that's a problem because you're trying to heal yourself, and therefore yourself somehow is external to you. And then he looks at what he calls the dramaturgical self, which is the ability to exercise different roles, but not in the sense of being role playing and inauthentic, but authentically being all of the aspects of yourself and everyone else, which expands this notion of how do you be embedded. So I think he does do a lot, and especially in that 600-page thing on empathy, on looking at various psychological approaches to the self over time in order for him to understand how empathy, one, evolves and how our embeddedness in nature becomes more empathic. So yeah, it's there, but he doesn't talk about it in terms of soul. He does talk about it in terms of divinity, and never in terms of soul.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Gnostics and how they believed we were endowed with a divine intelligence, and that intelligence was creativity and intention. And unfortunately, the technological world doesn't have that. So even though we think we have artificial intelligence, it doesn't have the creativity or the intentionality that the human consciousness has. So I'm always feel like there's hope if we can reconnect ourselves to ourselves, that authenticity and the empathic. I would imagine that would be part of our endowment, but we just cut ourselves off from it through our life choices, and especially in America, because we're not very rooted and we're so technologically and extroverted and over consciousness. We're so obsessed with consciousness that we don't think about the unconscious, and it's necessary for our wholeness. So thank you for this topic. And like I said, I have a lot to think about and review. It was very rich.
I like it. This issue of technology is one that he has clearly struggled with. And he's not prepared to let it go. He's very much embodied in human life, and he's not a transcendentalist in the old sense. He's more an inclusivist. And so technology, like any tool, as long as there's an asymmetrical relationship, that is the right brain is the master and the technology is the emissary, he's okay with it. He's gone to court to fight genetic engineering. He's gone to court to fight excesses of technology. So he's very, very aware that you're always on the edge of chaos. You're always somehow or other at that if you're going to be creative, you're on that edge. And if you're not careful, you're going to fall off one way or the other. So maintaining that edge is really critical to him. So he's not prepared to fall off one way or the other.
Well, Lisa Reagan has got a related question to Michelle's, and you're welcome to stay on, Michelle, and maybe comment yourself. She said, this book is fantastic and will be crucial to helping me with my own advocacy work. I was happy to see his references to Goethe, but disappointed to see no mention of Rudolf Steiner, who has carried out Goethe's vision in his creation of biodynamics, Waldorf schools, etc. These fields are still very active and growing worldwide. Perhaps my question is, even in this book, there seems to be an invisible line that most scholars are hesitant to cross for many reasons. Does his book go far enough to get us to where we need to go spiritually? Or does he not go there? And that's related to what I think Michelle is probing as well. You know, I think one of the aspects of Jeremy's corpus of material is he's very sort of socio-technical. And even in the discussion of empathy, there's sort of a socio-technical container around it, almost a secular approach. And I think both Michelle and Lisa were hoping that he would break through and go into the realm of psyche and spirit in a more authentic way. I know Jeremy. I used to hang out with him in Washington in the old days. He's really, really bright, really, really sharp, and done.
Did he ever take you across that line? Did he ever reveal that his non-socio-technical side?
Not to me.
No.
Not to me, but I think that's what they're kind of getting at. Do you have any comment?
Just one, and that is that I was also disappointed. He raises Whitehead and process and reality in his discussion of dynamic and flow. And so if you look very far into Whitehead's work, you'll find that he hasn't gone very far into that at all. So he's taken a superficial approach to Whitehead. If you go into Whitehead through, say, Matthew Siegel, you'll find that Matthew connects Whitehead and Goethe and Steiner. And that's the connection I would have liked to see him make as well. That connection is made by Siegel in his book called Crossing the Threshold.
Yeah.
And it goes into etheric imagination, which answers your question, Michelle, too.
I think it's funny. I just brought this book with me. Y'all might find interesting.
Yeah.
It's called Goethe, the Scientist by Rudolf Steiner. A little synchronicity going on here.
Yeah. You know, let me raise a related point. I was at a bookstore here in Washington, D.C., waiting for a friend of mine to go out to dinner. And I began to peruse the books on the shelf. And I forget the name of the author, but I saw a book that has just come out called The Anxious Generation. And he was making the following point that I'd love to have actually both of you comment, because you have children, Michelle. He said that childhood is disappearing in the United States for the following two fundamental reasons. He says in the 1980s and 90s, there began to be a trend that basically engaged in massive overprotection of children. They weren't allowed to, go outside much. Parents were afraid they were going to hurt themselves. So schoolyards across the country took climbing bars and various other things away, massive vaccinations to protect against any conceivable illness. And that overprotection then gave way after 2000, particularly after 2007, in the advent of the cell phones, the Apple computer, etc., with underprotection. That we overprotected our kids from the environment and then we underprotected our kids from technology. And that combination, which was getting at what you were saying, Michelle, of the essential role of embeddedness in nature, when we became afraid that they may stub their toe on a root of the tree, so don't play by trees, you know, and then give them essentially carte blanche on Facebook and Twitter and social media, has created an epidemic of mental and emotional and psychological diseases among our young people. And I just would, starting with you, Randy, given your deep work with Jeremy Rifkin's material, how would you project that Jeremy would respond to this notion of an anxious generation and the evaporation of childhood, given his perspective on empathy?
I think he would agree with and he certainly talks about the dark side, the shadow side of all of these things, as positive, because where there's no light, there's no shadow. Where there's no shadow, there's no light. So he would agree that the age of connectivity has gone technological. And he talks in the book, this particular book, The Age of Resilience, about the forest schools, and how those are a way to counteract that and to get off the electronic connectivity to a connectivity with the spirit of nature. Mm-hmm. So I think he would respond favorably to what this author said. Although he, on the other hand, would not be afraid to take them on both. It's not one or the other for him. It's how do you balance them?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. In this book, by the way, he recommends no social media or cell phones until the child is 16 years old. Having raised two boys, I don't know how that's physically possible. Michelle can, but that's what he recommends, and apparently that's the consensus of people who know these things, including technologists in Silicon Valley who are ferocious about keeping their own kids away from technology because they know what it is. They know how insidious it can become. Michelle, what would be your comment on this?
Well, everything we're talking about is how do we relate to technology? How do we relate to each other? I mean, it takes that is empathy. How do we even relate to our own spirituality? You know, I think about Nietzsche and the Uberman. I mean, how the Uberman was the one of that Goethe is so connected that they are with everything. And so I think that technology is actually keeps us from it, even though we have the illusion of connection, but it makes us so busy and hijacks our brains, hijacks our attention, that it starts to create this anxiety because it keeps you from a meaningful life. And I think also, being an American, that we are not rooted in our own culture. We are still so young. We're not like we're in Europe, and that has this rich history that is vibrating with us all the time. So we're not even, I think the technology takes us unroots us. It cuts us off from our roots. So we have kind of a double whammy being in America. So yeah, I think it's I would say if I had to do it over again with kids, I would certainly keep them away from electronics as much as possible, only because they're developing their psyche and what, like nutrients, what do you put in your body? Mm-hmm. What do you put in your mind? What do you put in your spirit? And I think it's also a key to how we are going to relate to our idea of what is God or the goddess or what the great mother. And so we've lost that because we're always in a transcendent oriented culture that always thinks that everything's going to happen up here, this authoritarian
Exactly.
deity. So I think it's also even more so like, what is our guiding myth? And the Judeo-Christian psyche, whether or not you have that particular orientation, we're still impacted a great deal by the monotheistic religions. And so how are we going to relate to them? So I think it's all related to that feminine that this university is constantly reminding us about the divine feminine and why it's so important, because without it, we can't relate.
Thank you. Michelle.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jim. Hi. And this is such an interesting discussion. I'm really enjoying it a lot. But I was thinking, I think in the book, Rifkin actually is talking about how to integrate technology, but also stay connected to nature. It's a kind of a twofold for him there. And I really think that yes, I believe that technology can be an issue. But I don't think it's the issue. I think what you're saying there, Michelle, is we don't have an identity. That's actually the issue. And then the way that our systems, as we've been in this, 2.0 version of ourselves, this idea that we're just trained from very early not to pay attention to self, but to look to authority, to not speak up, to not be different, to go with the flow and not to find self. It starts in that base right there. And so, if we were finding an identity, what does that really mean? And maybe the American identity should be a new concept of who are we spiritually? We don't have old enough traditions to have big traditions. So maybe we create one now with the idea of we are self-aware people and we all operate with free will and individuality, but as a collective, glocally, like he's saying there. But I just, in the way that the systems are now with our politics, with our education, how do you infiltrate that when you have those factions, especially within corporations, that don't want that change? But the change is fundamental. It needs to happen from the ground, from the root.
Yeah, good point. Randy, what would be your comment? Where does identity fit into all this?
Identity is the basis of agency. And so your identity gives you a platform from which to act. And so what you're asking for, it sounds to me, an identity, is a place from which to act. And to bring it back to Rifkin, actually, I don't want to do that. What I wanted to do is go back to Michelle's point regarding technology. What's happening with the singularity and AI and things like that is that the right brain has completely gone to sleep. The left brain has taken over. So it's the rational, linear, cause and effect. That whole left brain approach is all there is. What's been lost is the right brain approach to life at all. And it should be an asymmetrical relationship with the right brain, all the things that Michelle is talking about, and you were talking about too, both Michelles, that being the primary foot. But it doesn't mean you don't have 2 feet.
Yeah.
So when it comes to identity, it's the ability to broadly associate yourself with your entire capacity, your unconscious, your conscious, the left brain, the right brain, all of that stuff, the spirit, the embeddedness in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Well, yeah, this is why I'm such a believer in the idea of teaching intuition from 6th grade, to 6-year-olds. This should be a foundation in education.
Totally.
So that they are operating with both hemispheres. And then as you're introducing external technology, they've got a more grounded place to be working from.
Totally.
So Michelle probably could hold up a book, the other Michelle. The Steiner talks about the Waldorf school system, and when they introduce intuition into the curriculum. Got one of those to hold up, Michelle?
Oh,
It was good.
I'm sorry. Oh, this?
No, one on the
My
Waldorf
very-
School. Steiner
Oh,
on
yes,
education.
yes.
Yeah. You know,
Yeah,
just
teaching cycles.
on a related note, because Michelle's part of our ET studies program, I'm finding this gap being here in Washington with the whole disclosure of UFOs and what they call unidentified anomalous phenomena now, UAP. The government and intelligence and military communities, they insist on looking at the UFO phenomenon purely from a left brain point of view.
Therefore, the ontology has to be physically real.
It has to be measurable, or it's not true, and then they wrestle with it. But the problem is they're dealing with a phenomenon that's essentially not bound by causative physics. And they don't know what to do with it. And that's part of the confusion and circularity around, because it's more than UFOs, it's the entire worldview of the Western mind that is being challenged and is in the process of collapse. And so, you know, what Rifkin is really pushing at is the integration that the Western mind is the most actively resisting. And I think it comes down to this fundamental point that Michelle's making, both Michelle's actually, but I think Michelle Dupree put it most recently, around identity. You know, we've kind of been cut off from our essential identity as part of nature. And we now have this ironclad identity of the left brain.
Which is the Kantian division.
And we have nothing else to cling on to, and we will defend it, you know, like going down with the Titanic, before we admit anything into our worldview that begins to broaden the very identity that we've cut ourselves off from. It's really an extraordinary moment in the history of the West.
Well, you know, one of the things I was noticing in your presentation, Randy, was also how Rifkin is noting there's the rise of the issue and then the collapse of the issue, and then a rise of an issue and then the collapse of it. And we, I think, are at the collapse and the beginning of a new rise. So this thinking that we have going on in this country, I think, is at its collapse.
Yeah.
At one level. And at other levels, it's on the rise.
Yeah.
So
good.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you start, what he talks about in the Enlightenment is that the relational thinking of Goethe and Schelling and Vico and Schopenhauer, that was already there and is finally coming out in Whitehead. And Whitehead was a book that was put away almost 100 years ago. He wrote it in 1929. And it's only in the last decade or two that people feel like they can now begin to understand it. So it's all there. And the undercurrents of the future have been around with us for a long time. And that's where you start to get into this idea of time is all encompassing.
Let me just raise another issue, and I know we're pushing against time, but I'm intrigued with this notion of the simultaneity of collapse and resurgence. I've been fascinated by American politics within that prism. I mean, just think for a moment. It was only about a month ago that everyone thought the election was over.
2 weeks ago, really.
Biden was too, too out of it to really be a candidate. And that debate in June really was like an astonishing experience. And then, of course, you had the assassination attempt. and then the Republican convention, and the ecstasy that surged through the Republican Party to say that God saved Trump so Trump can save America. And then less than a week later, Kamala Harris is the nominee. Biden drops. And
Okay.
Kamala just goes boom, supernova. And all of a sudden, what seemed to be over hadn't even begun. And the Republicans, who were ecstatic at the victory they could taste, now are floundering around trying to figure out how they regain their ground. So you're really right, Randy, in my view. It's all there all the time. And then there's this confluence of energy, and I would say astrology. It's worth noting that Trump, Biden, Kamala Harris all happened when Mars was conjunct Uranus, where aggressive energy and Promethean energy had come together as the Earth and Mars and Uranus were completely in alignment. And that energy just fractured through the system. And I was told just yesterday by someone who's familiar with Chinese astrology that we're in the year of the dragon. And both Kamala Harris and Tim Walz were born in the year of the dragon. And it was in the year of the horse dragon. And they were born in the year of the horse dragon because there's different kinds of dragons. And we are now in the year of the horse dragon. So I'd like to bring in that cosmological component to all this. We humans are not just sitting here completely independent and free of the rest of the cosmic matrix. We're in the matrix. And somehow the simultaneity of all things gets activated and then received, I think, through a combination of free will, but also I would argue or posit cosmic forces. I think those are very, very much at play.
Yeah.
You brought the archetypal into this, and that's wonderful. And that's not Rifkin.
Yeah, Rifkin doesn't go there. But since we're on among friends,
yeah.
I thought we could wax
I think we'd all like to move the discussion to the archetypal. Hillman would agree with you too.
Yeah, James Hillman would have gotten this point, and I think Jung would have been absolutely fascinated. Just absolutely fascinated. So Michelle, as we close this off, why don't you, since you're the lecturer next month, give us a heads up on what you're going to talk about in terms of Jung. This discussion is a good basis for your conversation next month.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, well, I'm always amazed about the sequence of how the books unfold. Like one book builds upon the next, and there's a synchronistic aspect. And I thought how rich that Randy has been speaking about resiliency and all these different factors to our deepest relation to ourselves and the earth. And so here we're going to come upon C.G. Jung's book, The Earth Has a Soul, and talking about nature and technology in the modern man. So I kind of hit on a few of those items or topics about, America is at risk, and why is that, and how can we understand it? What does it mean to what is really atrophied in our life, which is keeping us connected in that empathic relationship. And I'd also like to say, and even though Jung doesn't really go and talk about this, I think I'll also give you a little background about Jung was so influenced by the Gnostics. And if we can understand the Gnostics in their truest sense and not what we think that has been out there on different channels, they were very much like how to be an earth human being. I tell someone, I was like, I'm a human animal. That sounds kind of weird because we don't think about it that way, but we are. And that's very important. So, yeah, and what are our guiding myths? What does it mean to be human? And so all of that's going to play into the psyche. And as we are always trying to seek more, maybe that's part of our Achilles heel.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Michelle Dupree and Randy. These have been two
I know, that is amazing.
splendid presentations. I really want to commend you. And, you know, all three of these illustrious individuals, everyone are students at Ubiquity University in our Wisdom School and ET Studies program. Michelle just graduated. I had the honor of being in her oral exam, and she passed it with flying colors. And so thank you very much. Michelle will be up next month. So that'll bring us to a close, everyone. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the second Tuesday of September. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you, Randy. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Randy.